It all started today when my husband, Justin, casually suggested we move in with my parents. The idea of living with my family didn't seem like a huge issue at first, since they were, well, my parents. But I was caught completely off guard. I felt a rush of emotions, so strong that it almost brought me to tears. He had never mentioned anything about it before, and only a few days ago we were bidding farewell to my dad at his funeral. He'd been ill for so long, and we'd just gotten through the heart-wrenching experience of losing him. I was still struggling with the grief, and then, out of the blue, Justin packed up our things and said we were moving. He told me we were heading to the villa my dad had left me, which should have been a peaceful, comforting place filled with memories. But then, I was hit with another shock. The moment we arrived, my in-laws were already there, settling in. They had moved into the villa before us, without any warning. My head spun in disbelief. Let me introduce myself. I'm Natalie, 33, a designer with a successful career. I've been married to Justin for 3 years. My job is thriving, and I've worked hard to build a stable life, even owning an apartment in my name. I was doing well, but things had taken a turn in my personal life. My mother passed away when I was in college, and last year, my dad was diagnosed with cancer. His health declined despite treatments, and we were told to brace ourselves for the worst. Losing my mom was devastating enough, but losing my dad felt like the world was crumbling around me. He had always been a rock in my life, and despite being busy with work, I stayed in close contact with him. His illness was hard to bear, and I couldn't shake the worry. Throughout it all, Justin would ask about my dad's condition, but I couldn't shake the feeling he didn't truly care. It often seemed like he was just waiting for my dad to die so that things would go back to normal. There had always been tension. Justin seemed insecure about his career, often comparing his achievements to mine. I'd always hoped he'd be proud of my success, but instead, it felt like a constant competition. I wanted him to support me during tough times, especially when it came to caring for my father. But instead, I often felt abandoned. He'd act like a child, putting his own needs first. My dad, knowing how strained things had become, told us not to worry about him. He urged us to focus on our relationship, but I couldn't do that. I wanted to spend time with him, to be there for him while I still had the chance. But even during these difficult months, I began to resent Justin more. In the early days of our marriage, he had been so loving, so caring. But his insensitive comments about my dad's illness and the way he distanced himself from me during the hardest times began to chip away at my love for him. When my dad passed away, it felt like my world had fallen apart. We'd already sold our family home, and the burden of handling funeral arrangements was entirely on me. I couldn't understand why Justin, who worked from home, couldn't support me more during this time. He'd often disappear, lost in work calls, while I was drowning in grief and responsibility. I begged him for help, but he brushed me off, claiming he was busy. It felt as though he cared about nothing other than his own work. I was so angry and hurt. My dad's death intensified all the emotions I had been holding in. On the day of the funeral, my heart was heavy with sorrow, but as I spoke with my in-laws, Justin came back, smiling smugly. His demeanor felt so wrong, as if he didn't grasp the significance of the moment. It made me feel even more isolated. Still, the funeral went as smoothly as possible, and I did my best to hold it together. But then, just when I thought things couldn't get worse, Justin made his suggestion. "Let's move in with your parents," he said nonchalantly. "They're your parents, so it shouldn't be a problem, right?" His words hit me like a slap in the face. And then, as if trying to soften the blow, he added, "If you're against it, should we just get divorced?" He said it like a joke, but the weight of it was crushing. My mind raced. I had never heard him speak like this before. The suggestion seemed so out of place, especially in the wake of my father's death. I firmly rejected the idea, but it wasn't about my parents. My family home wasn't big enough for us all to live in. One of our rooms was already used as my workspace, and the other stored Justin's work things. But Justin wasn't listening. He just smiled and insisted we could live in the villa my dad had left me. I'd always cherished the villa. It was special to me, filled with memories of my dad and our life together. But to Justin, it seemed like nothing more than a piece of property to be taken over. His demands became selfish, and he kept pushing, refusing to acknowledge my feelings. I explained that living there with his parents would be difficult, but it didn't matter to him. My in-laws were already preparing to move in. I had a sinking feeling they had planned this while my dad was still alive. The villa was a beautiful and peaceful space, and my in-laws were eager to make it their own. Every time I voiced my discomfort, Justin would become angry, accusing me of being selfish, of thinking only about my father's illness and not about him. His harsh words cut through me, and I felt like I didn't even recognize the man I had married. He even said it took him a whole year to die, which was way too long. The coldness in his voice made me shiver. How could he speak like that about my father, about my grief? At that moment, I realized I had lost all the love I had for him. My heart ached, and I couldn't bring myself to look at him. All he cared about was taking over my father's place, my memories. But I couldn't just let him do it. I packed the essentials, left the house, and walked out, leaving Justin confused and speechless. I didn't want to explain anymore. It was painful enough to see my in-laws, who seemed to have waited for my father's passing so they could claim the villa as their own. It was an invasion of my space, of my grief. When we finally arrived at the villa, my suspicions were confirmed. My in-laws had already moved in, and my husband had secretly given them a key. My heart sank. It felt like a betrayal, a plot to take over my family's home without my consent. The house, once filled with warmth and memories of my father, now felt cold and alien. My in-laws, excited about their new life there, seemed oblivious to the significance of my father's passing. They were more focused on the villa's luxury, their future comfort. Their lack of sensitivity made me feel even more alone, like no one understood what I was going through. When Justin joined them, laughing with his parents and cracking open beers, I felt a deep ache. This was the man I had loved, the man who now seemed so disconnected from my pain. They celebrated, not caring about the memories I was clinging to. My father's passing was reduced to just another inconvenience in their eyes, and it broke me. I couldn't stand it anymore. That evening, as I sat at the dining table with my parents, the weight of everything I had been holding in settled around me. My heart felt heavy, but I chose to hide my emotions and endure the night. The next morning, the stillness of the villa was suddenly shattered by my mother-in-law's shrill scream. The sound pierced the air, snapping me out of my thoughts. When I woke up, I found my father-in-law and husband in the midst of some commotion. It took me a moment to reach the source of the chaos. In the bathroom, my mother-in-law was on the floor, clutching her foot in panic. She explained that the floor had given way beneath her, but as my husband and father-in-law inspected the area, they couldn't find any issue. It seemed fine to them. I suggested they check a slightly discolored part of the floor, and when they stepped on it, the board creaked and sank a little before snapping back into place when lifted. I couldn't help but explain that this wasn't a mistake, it was intentional. My father, who had been an avid ninja enthusiast, had installed hidden mechanisms and traps all around the villa, creating what he liked to call his mechanical mansion. It was his pride and joy, a home full of secrets and surprises. Growing up in the house, I had learned to navigate these quirks with ease, but my husband and his parents were completely unfamiliar with it. I could see their shock and confusion. They had been so enchanted by the luxury of the villa, oblivious to the intricacies my father had carefully woven into the design. Their lack of understanding and respect for his hobbies had led them to overlook a crucial detail. The house wasn't just a regular home. Despite my warnings, they hadn't taken the trap seriously, and now their ignorance was coming back to haunt them. As my husband and father-in-law accidentally triggered another trap, causing them both to fall, I couldn't help but smirk. I wasn't going to sugarcoat it anymore. "Please, feel free to stay as long as you like," I said, but my tone was dripping with sarcasm. The reality was that they were completely overwhelmed by the villa's tricks, and I couldn't bring myself to feel sympathy. As they argued about what to do next, I quietly prepared to leave, my own plans already in motion. "I'll head back to the apartment to prepare for our move," I told them, though I had no intention of packing. Instead, I planned to take a few days to go through my father's belongings, finding a little peace amidst the chaos. True to form, my husband and in-laws couldn't last more than 2 days in the villa before they'd had enough. Meanwhile, I was relishing the solitude, slowly piecing together my new life. The villa, once just a home for me, had started to take on a new life of its own. It became something of a local attraction, its trick mansion reputation spreading quickly through the neighborhood. Visitors, some curious and others simply fascinated by the eccentricity of it all, started arriving regularly. Local children would play in the villa, and it became a vibrant spot in the community. Growing up multilingual, I found myself taking calls from foreign visitors, answering questions about the villa in several languages. My husband and in-laws, however, struggled with the language barrier, only adding to their frustration. The traps, which had once seemed like a quirky part of home, became a constant source of anxiety for them. They couldn't escape the unfamiliarity of it all, and before long, they were sleep-deprived and exhausted. They longed to return to the apartment, and when they finally did, they had no choice but to face the reality of their situation. They had been so eager to claim the villa, but in the end, it was more than they could handle. As I sat back and watched their misery, I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. They had underestimated my father's legacy, disregarded my warnings, and now they were paying the price. "Why don't we all just live in the apartment together?" I suggested mockingly, knowing they would never agree to it after their failed attempt at living in the villa. Instead of offering them tea, I handed my husband the divorce papers, already filled out and stamped in my name. His confusion was evident as he looked at the papers. "What happened? You used to love me," he asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. I couldn't help but laugh bitterly at his obliviousness. "You think I could love someone who wished for my beloved father's early death and would have rejoiced when he passed?" I retorted, the anger that had built up inside me finally pouring out. I handed him the divorce papers once again, this time with finality. "I can't forgive you for disregarding my feelings, for being so insensitive and selfish. You made decisions without consulting me, and now this is where we are," I said, my voice calm but resolute. "This is my apartment, and if you have a problem with that, then you should be the one to leave." He didn't say anything in response. He was silent, and it was clear that he had nothing left to say. I could see the shame on his face, and for once, I felt free of the guilt that had weighed me down for so long. As I drove them out of the apartment, I couldn't help but reflect on how much things had changed. My husband and his parents, who had once relied on me financially, now found themselves with nothing. With no money and no place to go, they ended up in a cheap, low-quality apartment, struggling to make ends meet. My husband, once confident and proud, now worked a late-night convenience store job, unable to even afford to live without me. Over time, he became resentful, his frustrations bubbling to the surface. His parents, who had been so eager to gain control over my father's villa, now found themselves struggling with regret. They blamed him for their situation, accusing him of not being responsible enough to check the house before moving in. Their arguments were constant, but the truth was that they were all paying the price for their selfishness. Meanwhile, my career as a designer took off in ways I could never have imagined. In the wake of my father's death and the divorce, I began to channel my grief into my work. I started incorporating elements from my father's passion for ninjas into my designs, and soon enough, they gained traction. One day, a major cosmetics company reached out to me to design packaging with an Asian touch, inspired by ninja culture. This project became a turning point in my career, and it felt like a tribute to my father, a way to preserve his memory. With this newfound success, I was able to transform the villa into something truly special. I kept it as a place filled with memories of my father, but I also made it accessible to the public. I started organizing tours, opening it up to the community and to tourists who wanted to see the Trick Mansion for themselves. The house became a local attraction, and soon, it gained international attention. Foreign visitors sent donations to help with the upkeep of the villa, many of them elderly fans who shared my father's love for ninjas. The villa, once a symbol of personal loss and betrayal, became a symbol of resilience and transformation. It not only brought in a steady income, but it also brought me peace. My father's legacy was alive in every corner of that house, and through it, I found a way to heal. Although I had lost my father and my marriage, I realized the gains had far outweighed the losses. I had grown stronger, both personally and professionally, and I was more optimistic about the future than ever before.